So thank you, Sil. So yeah, this morning we're talking about joint business planning, and when we started the discussion, it struck me that in a room full of sales-focused people and FMCG people, that I thought kind of you would be the experts on joint business planning. But what I discovered when I talked to lots of different people, both on the sales and the buying side, was that there are quite significant varying degrees of understanding and approach and strategy on them. And what we're going to do this morning is kind of blow that open a little bit. So hopefully there'll be a level playing field of understanding afterwards. Hopefully I'm going to provoke some thought as well, because if there's elements of what we're going through this morning that you're not currently doing, then you can bring those to work tomorrow and start thinking about them. So the topic's quite big, and it was a real challenge to actually keep it very focused, so that you could have very, very key takeouts. But I've tried my best to do that, and I've taken my lead from some good contacts in the retail head offices, and then also from the supply base as well. So we're talking about joint business planning. Before we do that, just take 30 seconds to run through the marketplace at the moment. You may or may not all be in the grocery field, but I can see lots of grocery people around the room. So it's a very competitive environment at the moment. You've got lots of very mixed and contradictory trends. You've got costs of production going up. You've got volatility around exchange rates. You've got a real tough battle on market share between key competitors, and it's a bit of a stalemate as well. And you've got all of these things creating huge amounts of pressure. And very often that pressure comes back down onto you as the salespeople. So hopefully at the end of today's session you'll be better equipped to deal with some of that. So this morning's session broken down into about 6 parts. Firstly, we're going to go through the fundamentals of selling, because I think if you're going to talk about joint business planning, you can't restrict it to like one set of meetings in the year. You're going to be best equipped to have a very effective joint business plan if you're doing all the things right in the other 51 weeks of the year. And you can't expect to get a really effective joint business plan agreed if you're not doing those things right. So we're going to go through some of those fundamentals, those basics of selling. We're going to talk about what is a JBP and the kind of the mixed understanding around what a JBP actually stands for. What are the challenges around the JBPs? And that'll be the result of discussions both with suppliers and with buyers that I've been having over the last couple of weeks. We're going to talk about the different approaches that different businesses take to joint business planning. I'm going to bring it to life with a case study, and the case study is a completely made-up company. If there are any coincidences to people either living or dead, then they're entirely coincidental. I was trying to think about the disclaimer they put at the end of movies. It's entirely fictional, okay? And if it feels like you or somebody you know, that's not the intent. And then we're going to wrap it up then, just bring it all together. So we're going to kick on into here. I can see, as a result of all of those mixed dynamics and that pressure, there's really about 12 retail strategies that the big retailers are deploying. First of all, they're looking at their value proposition. They want to be as cheap as possible on the lines that it really matters on. But then they also have to make a few bob as well, and retailers kind of globally make about 2 or 3%, so it's fairly narrow margins. So one of the things they're doing is premiumizing their ranges as well, and you can see an awful lot more premium products on shelf now in all of the retailers. I actually think that in some of the houses it's got to a tipping point where if they put any more black packaging on sale, they'll start to look expensive. So watch this space in the coming months. You might see a lot more price activity, price and value-based advertising, and maybe a lot of comparison-based advertising. So watch out for that. But it's a mixed strategy of being really cheap where you need to and then trying to make your money somewhere else. The retailers, they've always been very good at buying, but they're applying some very mixed strategies. They're being very aggressive in some purchasing models. They're tendering maybe much more frequently than they were previously. And then in other models then, perhaps in the same retailer, perhaps in the same category, they're being a lot more partnership orientated. So they understand that they need to have longer term relationships to allow you to invest in your businesses so that they can extract some value from that. So you've got, again, very, very mixed activities. They're looking at terms, how frequently they pay you, the discounts, etc., all around that. Interestingly, they're starting to look an awful lot more at their supply chains as well. So they're starting not to just put the pressure back on you, but actually look inwardly and see where they can make efficiencies. We'll come back to that later on, because you're not really going to fully sweat those opportunities unless you talk to your suppliers and do that work together. So that's one of those kind of joint value creation pieces. They're consolidating, they're maybe working with less suppliers, and in certain categories they're working with more suppliers, but all to get the same net result, which is better cost prices. They're looking at their specifications, they're taking out materials, and isn't it great if they can take out cost and also tick the box of their sustainability agenda by using less packaging or less cardboard, etc. They're looking at their ranges. Some of them are expanding their ranges, some of them are simplifying their ranges, but they're trying to get a range which fits the needs of their consumers and their future consumers. One of the key things is that they're getting really, really clear about the tiering within their ranges, and they're getting so much better at making that turn up on shelf. So you can really, really see the different quality tiers and pricing tiers. A lot of that stuff is quite common to all of the retailers. So where they're trying to differentiate is on things like in-store experience. And you can feel, if you go shopping in all of the main grocery retailers, you can feel that some of them have really put an effort into the service experience in store. I can certainly see the differences, and they're really interested in measuring what consumers think. So when you go through the airport and you slap the smiley face or the sad face, some of the retailers have those in stores now, because they're interested to find out what the work they're doing and what the result is coming from, what result is coming from that. They've all identified fresh foods as a real battleground, and they'll pick one or more categories to make a really serious effort at it. They've identified provenance. The customer really, really wants to know where the products come from, and they want the micro detail as well, the townland the product comes from, rather than just the country. And now they're actually getting into ethical areas. Now, I think that the retail efforts on ethical trading or sustainability agendas, there's really two areas where they've gone to first, and they're the two areas that I would have gone to first as well, which are, if you can, like I say, take material out of your system and save some money, but also save the earth, then isn't that great? Because there's an instant benefit to your bottom line. You're using less stuff and you're saving money, but you're also saving the earth. Tick that box. The second one is around PR. So if you can demonstrate that you're really, really fair to deal with, that you do great ethical business with your suppliers, then you're probably going to be judged as doing kind of ethical business with your customers as well. So that's why you see all of the PR activity around supplier academies and kickstart programs, and even Aldi now have a Grow with Aldi program that they're kicking off at the moment. So that could be, I'm imagining it'll be like an X factor of small artisan suppliers. They'll all get a chance on shelf at some stage in September or October. It'll be lined up with the Ploughing Championships, and then some of those will be accepted into the store on a full-time basis. And those retailers will sweat that. They'll really sweat that, because that's great PR. Now, what's coming down the track, and which a lot of people aren't really talking about, is legislation, kind of global world trend, and then being enacted in national legislation around actual ethical trading. And I'm talking about things like modern slavery. So this stuff is coming at you. If you're not thinking about it, you should be thinking about it, because you could say, so we're a local Irish supplier, we know, how could we have anything to do with modern slavery? But you buy materials, you have suppliers, and they have suppliers, and they have subcontractors, and some of those are primary producers. And they could be impinging on workers' rights somewhere very, very far away, like Myanmar. So you need to start thinking about that kind of stuff, and the retailers will need to start thinking about it too. So you've got a real mixed up market. It's very high pressure, bit of a stalemate, lots of different strategies being deployed. Some of them are quite mixed and contradictory, but it's all going on there at the moment. And what does that mean? It kind of means that you need to be really, really good at the fundamentals, the basics. Hands up who was at the session that I did before Christmas on NAM basics. Was anybody in the room at that session? Okay, so there's a few. So this won't be repetitive then for most of the room. The basics, as I see them, are administration, quality, commercials, market awareness, marketing, formats and channels, operations, conduct of business, service levels, category management, relationships, and alignment. So there's 12 basics there. So what I want you to do is have a quick look at those, give yourself a score out of 12, and put your hand up if you're getting 12 out of 12 right. So take 30 seconds just to have a look at the screen, and then I'll ask for a show of hands. Right, so hands up, who's getting 12 out of 12? Most of the time. You know, nobody's perfect, you make mistakes, but most of the time, who's got 12 out of 12? Okay, so who's got 11 out of 12? Okay, that's one, so we're starting to get in there. Okay, who's got 9 out of 12? We'll skip a few. Okay, so we've got a few more there now. Okay, who's getting half of these things right most of the time? Okay, so we're talking about a third of the room there. We won't go any further. I understand that you might be a bit nervous about sticking your hand up, but about half of the room is getting this stuff half right most of the time. So you've got significant room to improve just on the basics, just on the fundamentals, and take a scan through those and kind of say, well, what are the things I need to improve in my personal performance when dealing with my customers, or my business's performance when dealing with customers? I'll put a little bit of meat on the bones of these things. These are so important because if you're not getting these things right most of the time, your customer's not going to want to have a strategic conversation with you about a joint business plan. Why would you want to get into bed with somebody who causes you problems by not getting these things right most of the time? Does that make sense? Okay, so the first one is administration. Such a boring topic. Poor administration costs money. It costs you money and it costs them money. So you've got to follow their rules. You've got to respond to their queries. You've got to take a right first time approach, and you've got to review it. You've got to review your own administration, and you've got to help them review their administration, because if you don't have the right case size in their database, then it won't order the right quantities, and you'll be scratching your head wondering why you've got availability issues. So administration is really important. This is such an important one. It comes top of the list of every time you ask a buyer what's important to them. And if you get it wrong, it just ruins your relationship. Quality as well, you've got to be aware of your own specs. You've got to sample the market and know what your competitors are doing, and you've got to be able to communicate that in quite a basic fashion to your customers, the buyers. A robust complaint system. If you're working in private label, you've got to have a quality improvement plan. And you've got to understand the factors that influence quality, because very often the factors that influence quality are the factors that influence cost, which brings it on to commercials. Understand your value proposition. Understand that the commercial interaction with your customers isn't just about an annual negotiation now, it's always on. You've got to be ready for that. So that comes down to your negotiation skills. And if it is always on and they're always asking for something, then you should be always asking for something back. Never give anything without getting something. Understand the market. Never underestimate the inability of a buyer in a head office to get out to their own stores. They may do 20 minutes on a Saturday when they're doing their own shopping, but they never get to the competitors' stores, and they never get to anything outside of the country. And you're in a position to do that because some of you are part of international organizations. You can bring those insights to those buyers. You can give them the little nuggets that they can bring to their Monday morning meeting and look like they're really switched on with the rest of the market. Obviously, you've got to observe competition law and not give any secrets, but if it's on the shelf, you can share it. And share those nuggets. It's a really, really good way of currying favor with your customers, those individual buyers that you deal with. Be part of their marketing plan. I think this is a great one when you can advance your business's objectives by helping them spend their money. That has to feel like a sweet spot. And you do that through your promotional activity, your stories around provenance, your PR stories, and your in-store activations. But get on board their marketing bus. Understand their formats and channels as well, because even if you have a bricks and mortar retailer who doesn't have an online element or a convenience store element, they're going to have regional variations as well, and it's your job to understand those because the business isn't all in Dublin. So understand their formats and their channels and their regional variations. Optimize your business into all of those different variations and nuanced differences. And engage with the leads, because all of these retail organizations will have somebody who deals with the country stores and the city stores. They'll have somebody who heads up their convenience division as opposed to their supermarket and hypermarket division. So those people need to be engaged. And this is where we kind of come into the first element of this the concept of a wide network strategy or broad network strategy. Your business needs to engage widely with the consumer. You can't just deal with the buyer. That's not an effective strategy. And it's particularly ineffective when you get into trouble, if you're in the middle of a tough negotiation and they close down the shutters and don't want to talk to you. But if you've got an active network and active communications into a dozen people in their organization, then somebody will speak to you. Understanding their operations. It's vitally important that your products are available in danger of being sold. But to do that, you have to understand their operation, and you have to understand things like how your product carries through that supply chain, and not just your part of the supply chain, but their part of the supply chain. And if your product has some inherent flaw in its design, maybe in its packaging, that stops it or slows it down from moving through that supply chain, vitally important that you get sight of that, because again, you could be scratching your head wondering why your product isn't available when you deliver 100% on time and in full. If it moves slowly through their supply chain, it could impact on shelf life, it could create waste, and then you're just in delist territory. You know, you don't have a future there. If it slows down productivity in store as well, they'll be really conscious of that. If your product is the one that constantly opens when they're packing the freezer, then that product is in danger of being delisted because it slows them down, and they have enough staff challenges as it is, so don't make it any worse for them. Business conduct is really important, and thankfully there's lots of very well developed standards around grocery regulations and competition authority, etc., bribery and corruption. Everybody does their training on this. These things should be just standard, and you have to carry yourself with consummate professionalism. And if there's any kind of glint of somebody stepping away from that, do not hesitate to bring them back in line for their own safety, for their own good. Bring them back into line. Focus on service levels. And service levels aren't just about your ability to turn up at their warehouse as expected with all of the goods that they've ordered. Service levels are about more than just turning up with the goods. They're about your ability to score on quality, your ability to score on administration. And I think here what you're getting into is a much bigger scorecard, a much bigger dashboard that isn't just about your ability to turn up with the goods. So there are many other soft measures that should be on that scoreboard, and you need to understand where you sit versus your competitors. Because you could be better than average, and it could be a strength that you're not aware of. It could be something that you can lean back on when it comes to that time when they're going through the supplier selection process, and you could win that business on the basis of maybe a softer measure. Remember, none of these buyers really like change, and they definitely don't like risk, because 90% of their time is taken up on internal meetings and governance and maybe a little bit of politics, and they don't want suppliers who cause them any problems. And if you make a supplier selection decision and it goes wrong and you've got an availability issue, you'll never do it again. So you can sweat that as a strength if you're really good at it, and if you're not good at it, you need to get good at it. Category management then, it sounds more complicated than it is. You need to know what their strategy is. Generally in the store with their consumers, and then by category, and you need to understand what your role is within that category and how you can line up your strategy with their strategy. It's based on insights, but what it leads to then is a really thorough understanding of the architecture, how the products come together in a category, what sits beside what, how the quality tiers are structured and how they turn up on shelf, and how promotional activity feeds into that to drive your product performance, but also the category performance and the long-term category performance. Relationships are of vital importance as a fundamental. And like I've said before, you need to have a broad network strategy. You can't depend on just doing business with the buyer. If you invest all of that time in just doing business with the buyer, they'll get moved. They'll be gone in 2 years' time. The average residence time of a buyer is something like 2 years. You might be lucky to get 3 or 4 years. But if you have a broad network strategy, then you'll have a much more supportive environment there when things get challenging. And you can bring a supportive environment to their business as well. You need to be problem solvers, you need to be partners. Remember, you're really good at making stuff and selling stuff, and they're really good at reaching consumers in their shelves, getting them to take it off the shelf and get it through a till. So the approach here, the thought process that we're moving towards when we get from kind of traditional joint business planning up to joint value creation, you've got to remember that you're partners in this. And you've got to kind of stand up and be confident enough to say, we're really good at this, you're really good at that, and if we work together, then we can solve all of these consumers' needs. The real peak of intent for you then is to get to that kind of strategic partnership. And if you're not getting the basics right, you haven't a hope of getting there. But you've all been to the retailer conferences over the last number of years. They all get together once a year. And somebody very senior will get up on stage and say, these are our pillars, these are the things that are really important to our business, these are our objectives, these are the things that are going to really deliver for our customers. And they fall down into 4 categories or 4 buckets, and they'll call them pillars, etc. They might put a strategy house up on the screen. And more of you are developing your strategy houses. And the sweet spot is where you look at yours and theirs and see, well, actually, of the 4 pillars that you have and the 5 pillars that they have, there's 3 that overlap. So what you're in a position now is actually helping them to deliver their KPIs. And that's really the sweet spot. But to leave it at that isn't good enough, because how are you going to get those things lined up? How are you going to get the agreements in place that will actually deliver those week-to-week gains and business improvements? And how you do that is through your joint business planning. It's that agreement that you create with your customer. So what is a JBP? Does anybody want to hazard a guess? Anybody want to shout? Okay, hands up who's heard of the term JBP. Okay, so about 2/3 of the room. Okay, so there's also a third of the room for whom a JBP isn't part of their common language, and there's a good reason for that, because not everybody calls them JBPs. So I talked to lots of different people, and I tried to get a balanced view of what a JBP is, because if you just take, my last 2 jobs were with Aldi and with Tesco, and Aldi don't do JBPs at all, and Tesco very much did do JBPs, so you could have mixed understandings. So I spoke to lots of different people in the trade. Here's a selection of the answers I got. A JBP is a negotiated agreement between a supplier and a retailer. Simple enough. It's the product of the annual terms agreement. It's a piece of paper that records all the things the retailers have agreed to in order to justify a terms payment. So we've got some quite constructive commentary here, and we've got some pretty cynical commentary as well. And that's a common thread, probably with good enough reason. JBP meetings, they're simply negotiations. There's already a history of trading agreements in place. You're not starting from scratch. The retailer will want to hold what's there at the very least, and then secure an improvement every year if possible. For the supplier, it's about securing an agreement to initiatives, both tactical and strategic, that will help deliver the business plan. I thought that was one of the best explanations that I got. That was a really holistic view. It was about what they need, and it's about what we need. I thought that was a really good one. It's a collaborative plan of actions and initiatives within the trading year to drive growth for both parties. I thought that was a really good one as well, because it brought in the word collaboration. Because again, if you remember that you have to act as partners, even if you don't act that day to day, you're really good at making and supplying and marketing something. They're really, really good at reaching customers and selling something, and you have to work as partners to get it into the trolley or onto the kitchen table. The only challenge with that one is that they've identified that it's within the trading year. So that's automatically a short-term outlook. So that's something we'll come back to as well. It's about aligning our business strategy to their business needs. Generally, they just need more margin. So it's our job to leverage that need against the things that we need. And I think that's a fair enough assessment as well. We don't call them JBPs anymore. So here's an element of evolution. We don't call them JBPs anymore. They've been buy-sell plans for a few years now. An agreed plan of margin investment set against sales-driving activities. If we don't deliver on the activities, then we can't earn the monies. And what you've got now is a flavour of grocery regulations coming in there now, and accountability, which is good. Listings, promotions, end space, listing fees, volume discounts, and marketing money, etc. And that's all very tactical and very functional. Here's another one. Recently, they've morphed into buy, move, sell plans. It reflects the competitive and collaborative elements of the negotiation. So you've got that word collaborative and you've got that word negotiation coming back in. We want to buy as well as we can, so we can sell effectively. We commit to things that will help deliver sales growth for both parties. But we're also keen to look at the supply chain and make it work better for all of us, taking out costs where possible so that the profit benefits can be shared and reinvested. Another really, really holistic description of a JBP. They're not actually called JBPs at all now in that house. But there are challenges. So before we move on to the challenges, across the room, do you think there's anything that we've missed there, just in that kind of straw poll of buyers and suppliers? Is there anything you'd add, even just as key words for consideration in the discussion around JBPs? I'll throw it back out to you.
There was very little conversation around the category, the wider category.
Okay.
It was more about your own business.
Yeah, I heard another one there. Negotiation, yeah. So these are negotiated agreements, and there was 2 of the people who identified it there had identified the word negotiation. But you're right, nobody mentioned the category. The other flaw was that nobody mentioned anything in the long term. So, and that's why at the end of this morning, hopefully you'll see a path for evolving whatever you're doing right now in JBPs or buy-sell plans or buy-move-sell plans, whatever you're calling them with whatever customer you have, that you can bring in elements of a total category view, or the total store or the total business strategy, that you can make it potentially more long-term and less short-term. And that you can recognize that it's a negotiation. And if you don't recognize that it's a negotiation, then you'll suffer, it'll cost you money. And we'll talk about that later on. So I asked all of those same contacts then, what are the challenges with JBPs? And these come from both sides now, buyers and suppliers. What are the challenges with JBPs? The agreements don't always deliver for us. Still just a shakedown, but what choice do we have? We've had nothing written down in years. So actually there's a business who actually doesn't even have a JBP, don't even have an agreement, nothing written down. Maybe that reflects their size, who knows? Maybe it's the individual buyer that's doing it that way. It's just a transactional process. We have our list of demands, they have theirs. It's still quite short-term in approach, not very strategic, more about both sides hitting a target. And I think that sums up a lot of the things we talked about when we threw it out to the room. It's a transactional process. It's not particularly strategic. It won't have a full category view. It won't have a multi-year view. It's about hitting targets. The NAMs aren't as prepared as they used to be. It's less agile as a result. The whole process slows down. Have a think about that. That's how the people who are coming into head office are being viewed, in part. And have a think about those 12 fundamentals that we talked about. Because if you're not ticking the boxes on 12 of those most of the time, then that's potentially how you're going to be perceived, or your business is going to be perceived. They talk about collaboration, but the demands of the current year's budget never allow us to look forward to a different way of doing business. And I heard that a number of times. That's a composite quote. There's a couple of different people said the same thing to me. We're expected to deliver the plan, cost reductions, terms improvements, etc. It's up to me to grow the category and route that growth towards suppliers that are willing to invest. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Okay, so before we go on to the different approaches then, challenges with JBPs. Is there anything that we've missed there? Anything that you'd want to throw out there? Again, even if it's just keywords.
I would say it's the personal relationship that we need to develop with, because we can look on a high level but it basically comes down to people and their skills on both sides of the table and how they understand each other's real goals and what pushes their goals. It's almost what's in it for both parties.
Yeah.
How can you have that alignment at the end of the conversation?
Yeah, and to develop on that point, because it's a really good point, to develop on that point, you having that personal interaction is so vitally important day to day and week to week. The ability or the propensity of that buyer to return your call for a start, that's a really good place to start, isn't it? But if you make an agreement with them and you're wondering why it doesn't happen, or it falls a bit flat, or if it has a history of maybe 50% implementation, then what you've got to think about is not just the relationship with that individual, but the relationship with the overall business. We'll come back to this now. Because there's not just one relationship, there's a wide, broad network strategy that you need to think of. So we're going to move on to different approaches. So some businesses have joint business plans, some have buy, move, sell plans or buy-sell plans, some just have terms agreements, some have a contract and category plan, some have customer benefit plans. They all call them different things, but effectively they're all negotiated, category-focused agreements, probably in the short term, and probably not particularly strategic. And there's loads of different approaches and different names for them. And there's different templates as well, and some of them have no templates. So if you can think of a retailer that you're dealing with who doesn't have a JBB template, do you think they do bad negotiations? I don't think so. So it's not about the template. It's about the approach and how you can get benefits for your business and for the consumer out of it. So just to go into these in a little bit more depth, the basic kind of contract and category plan, probably the common way of dealing with a discounter. They'll do a category review. They'll identify their objectives for the category and the areas of opportunity. They'll do a tender process or some kind of supplier selection model. They'll enable some efficiencies in the supply chain because they'll always be looking at efficiencies in the supply chain. They'll play their part. There'll be a final negotiation and then there'll be some implementation, and they're really good at doing the implementation part. The challenge with this now is Not that it's customer driven, but that it's retailer managed, and you might not be part of the discussion. That's the real challenge with that, is that their category review process very often fails to engage you as well as you could. So you have to be kind of in their face, offering them all of the insights that you can. It's deflationary as well, which is good for the customer. Joint inflation creation. I kind of named this one myself when I sat back and thought about it. This may have been the traditional model of doing business until the very recent past. So you'd have ambitions, supplier would have ambitions, retailer, they'll have demands, they'll have their ambitions as well. They'll come head to head in a real tough negotiation, maybe once a year. There'll be a bit of hard bargaining, you know, what they gain, you lose, etc. It'll be very competitive, but there'll be an annual agreement and you'll get to the end of it because you kind of have to. Challenge with this is that it's probably upward only and it's inflationary. So if they're getting 2% improved terms from you, you were probably adding the 2% on. And that was being reflected in the consumer price index there. That whole period there, up until it peaked in 2009, that's what was happening. So joint inflation creation, it's an old way of doing business, but I mean, around the room you've been selling for kind of 10, 15, there's a few people here with 20 years of sales experience. This should feel familiar. But then it developed into joint business planning, which is where we started today's conversation, where you'd look at your business strategy, where they would look at their business strategy, and you'd have some broad objectives, some strategic objectives. And that might be supported by some insights. You know, you'd get some shopper data, and you'd share that data with each other, and you'd share your objectives with each other, and you'd create a list of initiatives that would deliver for them and deliver for you. The problem was that you had to kind of pay into that party up front, and in the execution and the monitoring of it, sometimes it fell down, and that's where you get those comments that the JPP doesn't always deliver for me. It didn't always deliver. It felt like a shakedown. It felt like I was giving money just for agreement's sake. Because when you got to the end of it and you assessed the benefits, you kind of didn't feel good. And it was probably upward only, and it was probably inflationary. Crucially, it was short term, and it only ever partially delivered for you. So where we want to take it, and where I'd suggest you need to take it if you're not there already, is joint value creation. And what this consists of is all of the elements of the previous JBP structure with about 5 or 6 additional elements. And I'm going to run through those very quickly, and then what we're going to do is look at a case study, an entirely fictional case study. Place to start now is in your values, your company's values, your brand position. You know, why do you get up in the morning? All the Simon Sinek stuff about the golden circle and starting with why. That's where businesses now who are doing really effective joint value creation, that's where they're starting. What are your values? What's your vision, your mission, your purpose? How does that funnel into your everyday activities? But how is it supported by a bigger cause? Because people who work with a bigger cause in mind, they commit more. You get more from them. And buyers are resonating with businesses that have a bigger cause. Because more and more of these buyers are millennials, you know, they're global citizens, etc. They'll be tough negotiators, but they need to think that they're doing something bigger, something better for the world. So that's where really excellent joint value creation starts, and that's a relatively new approach. And from that set of values, you know, that bigger view of your mission and your vision, and being conscious of what your purpose is day to day, never losing sight of that, you'll develop a business strategy, and it'll probably be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 year strategy. And from that strategy then, you'll have key pillars, you know, things that are important to you, things that are going to turn the dial for your business. You're going to hunt out some shopper insights the same way as you always did, and we'll go into a bit more detail about how you can get more from that, but you're still going to be supported by insights, by data. You're probably going to then have to do an end-to-end SWOT, and this again is a new bit for businesses. Very often when people did a SWOT analysis of their business, it was very much sales-driven. So instantly it didn't get a cross-functional view. It didn't get a 360 view of your business, never mind the market or your competitors. And for you to do a really effective SWOT, you have to do it end-to-end. You have to start literally in the field where the products are coming from. You've got to look at every step in the process, the sourcing models, the production models, how you market it, how you develop a new product development, how you identify innovation opportunities, how you sell it to customers, how you create new markets by identifying new needs that customers weren't even aware of, how you transfer those products through the supply chain and your logistics solutions. So an end-to-end SWOT probably can't be done with anything less than 10 different topics of discussion. And you've got to look at your business. you've got to look at your competitors' businesses, and then you've got to look at your customers as well. So that's a really effective end-to-end SWOT that effective businesses need to be doing. And then if you do your SWOT and you identify some areas for improvement, and you're conscious that it's all based on a set of really clear values and a brand position, you've got a business strategy with 4 or 5 really clear pillars, then you can start to get into strategy alignment. And this is the sweet spot for you doing strategic partnership business with retailers. Because if you can get 3 of your 4 pillars to line up with 3 of their 5 pillars, then you're really in a sweet spot, because selling is just solving problems. I always refer to the Dale Carnegie book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. If you're solving problems, then you're going to sell stuff. And that's what this part is about. If you can help them deliver their KPIs, tick 3 of the 5 boxes, then you're going to have a really good chance of being a partnership supplier. But then you've got to do the stuff you were doing previously with JBPs. You've got to share your data. They've got to share some of theirs. You've got to share your objectives as well and be really open about those. And from that process, then you're going to agree some initiatives that you're going to work on together. Now, then what you've got to do is have an effective negotiation, because there's benefits from those initiatives. Those things are going to deliver. They're going to deliver for the consumer. They're going to deliver for your customer, the retailer, but they have to deliver for you as well. And there has to be some sense of how that delivers, and the amount of delivery that it needs to happen for the consumer for you to create some kind of marginal gain for yourself and the customer, the retailer. So we'll come back to that later. What that requires maybe is a kind of a partial openness about your P&L, which means that you need to deliver 2 million business to deliver 20 grand of additional investment. And that'll depend on your individual P&L. But you've got to have a bit of a reality check there. And that negotiation needs to be really effective. We'll come back to that. You've got to then execute it and monitor it. And this was the bit that really fell down previously. If you were repeatedly saying, our JBPs don't really deliver, it's all about the execution and the monitoring. And if you notice that things aren't being delivered or things are going off path, then you require agile course correction. And that means really, really rapid identification of a problem, diagnosis of an issue, analysis of a couple of different options to fix it, and then get that fix in place as quickly as possible. And then you'll get to the end of the year and more of those initiatives will be delivered than in the previous model. And from that then, the net result is that you've created shared value. Your consumers are loving what you're doing, they're buying your product, they're consuming it in their kitchens. It's delivering for the retailer because their sales are up above category average or above market average, and it's delivering for you because you're selling more stuff, developing a category, opening up a new market. And that's what you have to aim for. So we're going to move on to the case study. So Nature's Island, little Irish company, 50 million turnover, good solid company. They're listed nationally with all of the retailers. They might even have a bit of food service business. It's 80% branded. They've got a decent brand. They do a bit of PL for certain customers, and they do a little bit of export as well into the UK. They've got 1 or 2 customers in the UK. They're the number 3 brand in their category, so they're maybe bigger, but there's also smaller players there as well. They're in business 35 years, and they're in the 2nd generation. So the sons and daughters of the founder are now running the business. This is entirely made up, okay? And what they did then was they went through that joint value creation cycle. And they said, well, what are we doing now? And what is the opportunity for improvement? How can we get this joint business plan to land? Because they were the people who were saying, it doesn't deliver for us. It feels like a shakedown. We're just giving money and we're not getting anything back. So that's where they were starting from, and they went through the joint value creation model, the path. Where were they? They were too busy to philosophize. They were looking to the end of the week. It was all very, very short term. And actually talking about brand position and values and why they get up in the morning, that was all kind of uncomfortable territory for them. Needed to be facilitated, and they needed to get comfortable with kind of standing back and looking at themselves. And there were issues with the 2nd generation, as there always are. There's issues with the 2nd generation. Because what they'd done is they'd managed to forget what made the company great in the first place. And the people who had made the company great in the first place didn't effectively summarize it either. They didn't make an assessment before they handed over to the 2nd generation of what was it that made us great. When you see an interview with a German company, we're in business 150 years, so there's generations and generations of industry success. So what is it that makes you successful after 150 years? Well, we never strayed away from our great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's values. There was something that carried through in their DNA. They identified it, because if you don't identify it and talk about it openly, you can forget it when you move to the next generation. So you need to live your values, and they need to be shared openly. You can't keep them secret within a business. And if you do share them, then they'll be lived and breathed by everybody in the business, and you'll have a much greater chance of passing it on to the next generation. And as a result of not doing that, they had faltering growth, and they were scratching their heads and wondering, what is it? What is it that, because it all worked so well previously. And they did a rebrand then, they did a packaging redesign, maybe spent some money on some TV ads, and, it just wasn't delivering, it wasn't landing for them. So what they did was they went back to basics, and they remembered what it was that made the company great in the first place. Why did we start? What was the vision? How did we want to change the world in some small way with our little factory and our little product? And they identified their values, the values of the business and the values of the people working in the business, because they're very much aligned. And they came up with a vision and a mission and a purpose, not so that they could put it up on a sign above reception when they were taking visitors, but so that they could live it and they could breathe it, and it could be consistent in their business. They could underpin everything that they do day to day. And then they looked at their business strategy. They did a 3-year plan, and they'd always had objectives, and they'd identified some pillars. But the challenge with doing a business strategy, and the thing that they identified when they did it, was that they hadn't previously done a capability check. So there's no point having 4 pillars that are going to really turn the dial and develop your business if you don't have the capabilities within the business to actually affect those changes. So they did a capability check, managed a few, and spotted a few gaps. And they also spotted through their SWOT that some of their basics were weak. Their administration was rubbish. They were losing money all over the place by having poor administration with their customers. And their commercial skills weren't great. They hated negotiating. They just were so uncomfortable with that potential conflict scenario. And their communication wasn't great, because they felt that every time they had a conversation with a retailer, it cost them money. So they just didn't communicate with them. But that kind of permeated their business as well, because they didn't communicate with each other. So there was some challenges there that they needed to fix before they were going to be able to actually execute a business strategy. Shopper insights. They'd spent some money on Kantar and Nielsen, and they always kind of felt a bit short. They didn't get the value from it. And, there'd been some money spent on some dunnhumby, and maybe they'd done some bespoke research before they did that brand redesign. But really what they needed was a bluffer's guide to the data, because very often they were going into meeting with buyers, talking through a deck of information that they didn't fully understand to a buyer who didn't fully understand it either. And both sides needed a bluffer's guide. So they did that. And they also worked on some integration, which is the kind of stuff that Talysis do. So how do you get all of these different data sources to work together? How can you funnel them so that you can take actionable insights and concise takeouts? Because if you're not delivering concise takeouts to a buyer, nothing will land. There's a world of emails that never got opened because they had a 20 megabyte attachment. And all of these original decks, they all start as 20 megabyte attachments. So you've got to take out the top 3 or 4 things, and if you have to, text them to the buyer and say, these are the things I need you to understand and keep in mind when you're doing your business. They did an end-to-end SWOT. Previously they had done SWOTs where they'd analysed internally, top line, and it was very sales driven. But the end-to-end detail was required, as I described earlier, and they needed to take a stakeholder view as well. They needed to talk not just internally to the management and the staff, but they needed to talk to their customers, and they needed to talk to their suppliers as well, because they needed to identify, was there any kind of mismatch, how this company operates and the values and the culture in the company. Were they viewed differently by that kind of triangle of stakeholders? And they identified a few issues, and they had to put a few fixes in place from that kind of 360 view. They identified also pretty immediate opportunities for improvement, for business improvement, around promotional effectiveness, the kind of monies they were spending on promotions and what it was actually delivering for them and their customers. They identified logistics issues, supply chain inefficiencies that they could implement almost immediate fixes for, and again, save some money. And they realized that their products weren't available on shelf, and if they're not on shelf, then they're not in danger of being sold. So that end-to-end SWOT was so insightful for them, and it fed into their strategy. And then when you have a strategy, you have a hope of aligning your strategy with that of your customers. They were always kind of clear on their strategy, but they had no visibility of their customer's strategy. And they certainly weren't driven by their customer's strategy. So there was no sense of that partnership, in terms of that partnership between a supplier and a retailer to reach that end consumer. And that was the way they had always done their business, but their business wasn't delivering. So they took a more holistic view, and they said, well, if selling is about problem solving, then what are the problems that we need to solve? And to identify the problems they needed to solve, they needed to identify the people who had those problems. And what they realized was that there were so many more people than the buyer. That buyer had a whole organization behind him or her. They had marketing people, they had PR people, they had logistics people, they had technical people and food safety people, and they all had problems that needed to be solved. They all needed to have some skin in the game for you to really, really land a dynamic joint value creation program. Thankfully, the retailers were much more open with their strategies, and they shared their pillars at their annual conference. And when you got in front of the buyer, Nature's Island, they found that the buyer was actually reasonably aligned then with what the CEO had said, because that was a risk, just that it wouldn't be aligned. And they discovered then at that point that there was some pillar overlap around health strategy, around sustainability as well. So they were things that were important to Nature's Island, and they were actually important to not just the buyer, but the buyer's business. CEO had mentioned them as well. They actually, you kind of thought, might have been in their KPIs. In fact, they may have been a part of their bonus delivery this year. So you were going to help them get their bonus. They got into the data sharing and objective sharing phase. And previously, they'd kept their cards close to their chest. You know, they hated negotiation. They just put it on a long finger as far as possible. And when they were there, they kind of froze up. They didn't know how to dance. You didn't know how to interact with their opponent. And they had said that, you know, anytime I converse with these people, it costs me money. So I just try to avoid it. And as a result, the communications were poor. So then they needed to step change. They needed to step change their own internal communications within the business, but also how they communicated with their customers. They established some concise takeouts. They started having value-added conversations. And this was in the whole year up to when the next JBP was going to be negotiated. Because if you're not doing it every day and every week, then you can't expect to have a decent result from a JBP or a joint value creation conversation. They started to develop that narrative around mutual benefit. You know, I can deliver for you if you deliver for me. And sometimes that takes time to seed. You've got to seed that. You've got to change that narrative. And that will take time. But then it took time. They took a year at it. Crucially, they started to understand what the KPIs were of the people opposite them. Not just the buyer, but they understood specifically the buyer's KPIs and the overall business KPIs and the kind of things that the technical people and the marketing people were judged on. And they tried to build that into their plans so they could solve more problems with the strategies that they were putting in place. If you don't understand your customers' KPIs, then it'll be entirely coincidental if you have a positive impact on them. And your ability to do strategic business with your customers will be defined by how effectively you deliver their KPIs. They agreed some shared initiatives then. So it was a really, really belt and braces approach then when they got into the whole JBP, joint value creation discussion. Previously, the plans had fallen flat. You know, they'd invested, but it was unconditional. They had to spend the money, and then they got to the end of the year, and it hadn't really delivered for them. It hadn't delivered for the consumer either. It actually had just delivered for the customer, for the retailer. So they took a different view. They said, let's talk about clear joint benefits, and let's talk about joint accountability. So we'll do our bit, but you have to do your bit as well. And it wasn't just about the buyer doing their bit. It was about the overall organization doing their bit on both sides. So what that required was functional buy-in. You know, so the 4 or 5 functions that make up your business needed to tie in with the 4 or 5 functions that made up their business. But also you needed to get buy-in on a hierarchy level, because there's no point making an agreement with a buyer who doesn't have the backing of the commercial director or the CEO if it's out of sync with the overall strategy. And that's when they got into kind of discussions around, well, actually, can we meet the commercial director on a more regular basis instead of just at the annual conference? And is there any chance we could get in with the CEO, even if it's just for 15 minutes, quick coffee, we're here, don't forget about us. And they started to do that kind of stuff, and they really had to take a deep breath before they went into those meetings because they were highly intimidated. This is a relatively small company, remember. And they developed both a short-term plan and a long-term plan, because what they answered was their own issue, which is that these JBPs, they weren't delivering, and they never looked beyond the year. So they looked at ways to do that. And then they said, we need to get into an effective negotiation. And that negotiation just wasn't about one variable, like the terms or the cost price or the LTA. What they wanted and what they managed to agree was a multi-element agreement. And those multiple elements, they delivered joint benefits. Some for the customer, some for the supplier, and some for the consumer as well. Joint benefits across that partnership, that supply chain. Joint accountability as well. There was function and hierarchy buy-in. Crucially, at this point, they agreed the benefit split. If we do this business and it creates this change, it's going to deliver benefits. And how are we going to share those benefits? And remember, all of these people are trained not to split it 50-50. So you've got to just get your negotiation shoes on and get into that mode and agree a benefit split that works for you. And to do that, sometimes it requires a bit of a reality check for the person who's opposite you. Remember now, if a business wants to create a 1% improvement in its costs over the year, and that'll be at the kind of group level, a challenge will be given to the MD or the CEO to deliver that 1%. And when that person at that level passes that down on to the commercial director, it'll be multiplied up. It'll be 2%, because if they only deliver half of it, we'll still be okay. The commercial director will deliver it to the category directors or the category heads, and they'll ask for 3%. The category director will then have a conversation with all the senior buyers and say, I need 4 or 5%. And the senior buyer will have a discussion with the category buyers and say, we need to have a 6% improvement in terms. So that's how you have these discussions where entirely weighty asks are being made. It's because there's a multiplier effect between a business who wants to deliver something but isn't confident that it'll deliver everything. So they never pitch it low, they pitch it high. So you have to pitch it high as well. You've got to aim high in your negotiations. And some of that required both a short-term and a long-term view. And we'll go into the examples of that. To get your negotiation boots on, they did a course on effective negotiation, and they identified that it was all about preparation. It was all about preparation. They not only got the training, but they took the opportunity to develop a culture of negotiation within their business. They practiced it every day. They talked about negotiation. Because remember that as a supplier versus a retailer, they're more match fit. They have more opportunities to do a negotiation. So in the work that I've done on negotiation skills, I always do a bit of a survey with the people coming into the room. And what I found is that sellers automatically start off with a view that they have less leverage than buyers. And sellers are on average 14 years experienced, and the buyers are on average 4 years experienced. So people with 10 years less experience think they've got more leverage, and there's a reason for that, just because they're buyers and you're sellers. And that's just kind of the cultural norm. There's also other reasons for that inherent in it, is that they're more match fit. In the 14 years that seller was going negotiating with retailers, they negotiated with a certain frequency that meant that they had built up maybe 10,000 hours of negotiation activity, but they weren't doing it with the same frequency as the buyers. And if you're doing it with a higher frequency, you're going to build up that culture of negotiation. Net result of that was that when I asked those buyers and suppliers, are you negotiating collaboratively or are you negotiating competitively? 86% of the suppliers said that they were approaching negotiations in a collaborative manner. And 52% of the buyers said that they were approaching negotiations in a collaborative manner. So you see the difference there. If you're approaching it collaboratively and they're approaching it competitively, then instantly you're going to be at a disadvantage. So you need to present them the opportunities to collaborate with you, but you also need to be ready for a competitive negotiation, at least on elements of the negotiation. You can maybe collaborate on other things. But they got the skills. They were a lot more confident going into the negotiation. They were aware of their points of leverage as well as their customers' points of weakness. And they applied a decent strategy. So they had an effective negotiation. And from that negotiation then came an agreement, whether they called it a JBP or a terms agreement or a JVC or whatever. And there was no particular focus on the template that it was recorded in. Previously, they'd focused on discounts, rebates, promotional space, payment terms, really tactical things. The new agreement that they got in place was about an efficient supply chain. And there needed to be efficiencies made in the supply chain so that immediate benefits could be given to that relationship. There was reduced stockholding opportunities identified. They shared some knowledge on input costs because actually some of the key ingredients that the supplier were buying were actually being bought in huge quantities by the retailer. So they were able to share some material benefits to purchasing there. They agreed an equitable risk system on foreign exchange for the bit of business that was done in the UK. They took some actions immediately to challenge waste in the supply chain, but waste on food specifically. They implemented a packaging reduction project that would have short to medium term benefit delivery. With a new supply chain and some amendments to packaging, they were able to improve availability on shelves, so sales automatically went up. They actually managed to get a cost increase through as well in the middle of all of that, because there was recognition that one key commodity had really been causing them a major issue. They got their new product development listed. They actually backed that up with a really magnanimous approach by saying, actually, the range that we're selling you right now isn't effective, so we're actually going to take some of those items out. And that happens so rarely, but it's so respected by retailers. So when the range refresh came up, they said, listen, we're going to knock these out, but we want you to list these things as well. And they developed a promotional plan that was channel specific. They recognized that that business, their customer's business, was a varied business, and they couldn't have a one-size-fits-all approach to it. So that was the new multi-element, much more dynamic, joint value creating agreement. Round of applause. You know, they did a good job, but it doesn't just stop there. They had to execute it, and they had to monitor it. And there was shared responsibilities identified. They agreed milestones, and they agreed KPIs that they'd be judged against. Because if you think it's not delivering and they think it's kind of delivering, then you're going to get into issues. There can't be any kind of blurred area. There needs to be specific milestones and KPIs agreed. And open communications around that then. There's an agreed frequency for a monthly meeting. There was a top-to-top every 6 months. And there was multi-level and business-wide interaction. Your technical people had a constant conversation with their technical people. Your supply chain people were constantly talking to their supply chain people, et cetera, et cetera. So you had much quicker visibility of the issues so that you could then do your agile course correction. Because Plan A wasn't delivering. Well, certainly wasn't delivering in full, actually, because they were so proud that they got through this joint value creation process. They were so... just all of the energy had gone into that, such that when they're finished with that, they were, and they then were completely deflated when all of it wasn't delivering, and they were scratching their heads, wondering why. So they had to implement a rapid diagnosis, and they recognized the issues with it, and they put in place some fixes. Quick diagnosis, identified the options, and they put in place some fixes. Now, get towards the end of the year and through the year, you should be able to see what the benefits are accruing from all of this. And the payments then were versus activities, but they were also versus achievements. So there was a conditional element of it. And there was a total investment view as well, not just in front or back margin, but the total investment that supplier was making in that customer. It was grocery regs compliant, so everybody was clean, and there was no concerns about that. Crucially, there was an immediate benefit to that relationship, and there needed to be an immediate benefit to that relationship. There needed to be investment that could be made so that this supplier and retailer could agree a 2 or 3 year relationship, a 2 or 3 year agreement, something beyond the 1 year traditional agreement. So they found immediate savings so that they could make long-term investments, and there was a digital project that needed to be invested in that wasn't going to deliver until halfway through year 3. But they needed to make the immediate savings for their customer so that could have some foundation, some chance of running through on a 3-year agreement. So that long-term agreement was set in place. So they weren't going to have time wasted the following year and the year after that, having the same terms negotiation again. So to wrap it up, there's really 5 ingredients essentially that need to come together. If you're not doing it already, you need to look at the values of your organization. The values and how they can underpin a brand position, and how that brand position can underpin a strategy. A business strategy that's aligned to your objectives, but also to your values, and then also to your capabilities as well. You need to have the basic account management skills right, the basic sales skills, those 12 things that you reckoned you were getting 50% right most of the time. Because if you weren't getting those right most of the time, you don't have a hope of getting into a strategic partnership discussion. They needed to invest in negotiation skills, but not just as a one-off. They needed to develop a negotiation culture within their organization. They needed to talk about it, share best practice, and constantly look at upskilling. Read some books, look at some YouTube clips. They were doing all of that because they needed to be ready for those negotiations, because they knew that they were happening less frequently for them than they were for the buyers. And then they identified that to sell effectively, they needed to solve problems, but that they couldn't just have a blinkered view on whose problems they were solving. They looked at all of the different stakeholders and they tried to solve all of their problems. And they were the key ingredients. So that is where I'm going to wrap it up and where we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malachy.